So, I want you to picture this. You are sitting in the back of an armored troop transport.
Okay, I'm there.
Right. And it is just sweltering. I mean, the humidity is completely oppressive, and the jungle canopy above you is like so thick it literally blocks out the midday sun.
Sounds pretty miserable, honestly.
Oh, it's a nightmare scenario for a conventional force. But you've been sent here to eradicate this violent militant group, right? A group that has controlled this super remote territory for, well, a decade.
A long time to get entrenched.
Exactly. And your platoon is stacked. You've got top-of-the-line rifles, satellite uplinks, just overwhelming firepower. You are ready for a conventional war.
Right.
But when you finally reach the village clearing, there's no ambush.
Huh?
There's no firefight at all. Instead, you find that the militants are running a functioning school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're operating this whole shadowed court system that revolves around, like, resolving land disputes by sundown. They are fixing the irrigation ditches that the central government hasn't even looked at in 20 years.
That completely flips the script.
It totally does. Suddenly, your high-tech rifle feels, entirely useless because you realize in that exact moment that you cannot shoot a governance vacuum.
No, you really can't. And that realization, that is the absolute crux of everything we are unpacking today.
Yeah.
It's the moment an internal security apparatus wakes up to the fact that they are fighting the wrong war with the wrong tool.
Because they misunderstood the ecosystem.
Exactly. They fundamentally misunderstood the ecosystem of the threat.
It makes me think of an analogy. Think of an insurgency like a specific type of plant.
Okay, I like that.
You can't just take weed killer that was designed to, kill a desert cactus, ship it across the world, and spray it on a jungle vine.
Right, because the environment dictates the survival of the threat.
Exactly. If you don't understand the soil, which is the historical grievances, right? And the root system, which is the local economy, and the climate, which is the political landscape, you are never going to eradicate that weed.
In fact, by spraying the wrong chemical, you might accidentally fertilize it.
Oh, totally. You alienate the local population so badly that they actively start watering the vine themselves.
Because, it is a biological system, right? It's living, it's breathing, and it's highly adaptable. And the central mistake so many nations make time and time again is treating counterinsurgency as this binary copy-paste job.
Just dragging and dropping a solution.
Yeah. They look at a successful military campaign in one country and they just say, great, let's import that exact doctrine here. They assume what killed the cactus will automatically kill the vine.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are stepping into the shoes of military historians and internal security analysts today.
It's going to be a heavy one.
It is, but it's so fascinating. We have this incredibly dense source text in front of us. It's a comprehensive chapter titled Applicability of Counter-Terrorist Operations to Indian Scenario.
And it's basically a masterclass.
A total masterclass in the hard-earned lessons from decades of conflict across the South Asian subcontinent. And our driving mystery, the central question we are going to interrogate today, is exactly what we just touched on.
Can a successful counterinsurgency model from one specific environment be copied into another?
Right. Like if a country crushed a rebellion on an island using overwhelming force, can you deploy that same strategy in a landlocked jungle?
And spoiler alert, the short answer is absolutely not.
Not at all.
Because counterinsurgency success relies on this highly complex interlocking web of variables. To even begin forming a strategy, you have to analyze the specific history of the region, the nuances of local identity.
The physical geography, right?
Yes, geography. The current state of governance, the level of external support, and crucially, the attitude of the population. That establishes our foundational, non-negotiable rule.
One single solution cannot fit every conflict.
Exactly.
But wait, let me push back on that a little bit, because militaries, they love standardization.
Okay, love doctrine.
They love doctrine. If you have a group of armed people trying to overthrow the state, a bullet is a bullet, right? Why wouldn't a standard, overwhelming military response work across the board? If the state has a monopoly on violence, shouldn't they just be able to apply it?
It's a really common assumption. And honestly, it's exactly why so many states fail so spectacularly at this. Because look, an insurgency isn't just a military formation. It is a political organism.
Okay, a political organism.
Right. If you just apply overwhelming violence, you're only treating the symptoms. It's like trying to cure a chronic underlying disease with, a steady diet of painkillers.
Just numbing it.
Exactly. And the moment the painkillers wear off, the moment the troops rotate out of the valley, the disease flares right back up. and often it's worse than before. Our sources provide this phenomenal conceptual equation to understand this.
The root cause framework.
Yes. They lay out a root cause framework to show exactly what ingredients are required to build an insurgency that is actually resilient enough to survive the state's initial military response.
Let's break that equation down, because understanding how an insurgency is built is, well, it's the only way to understand how to dismantle it. The sources suggest you need a very specific combination of factors to get a prolonged conflict.
Right. Think of it as a literal addition problem. You need a historical grievance, plus identity mobilization,
Geographical isolation.
plus external support, plus governance gaps. When all of those align, you don't just get a riot or a breach rebellion, you get a multi-generational war.
I want to look under the hood of that equation for a second. Why do you need all of them? Like, what if you just have a massive historical grievance, terrible governance gaps, and deep geographical isolation, but you don't have any external support? Doesn't the sheer anger of the people sustain the fight?
Well, anger doesn't manufacture ammunition.
Ah,
Well,
wow.
that's the cold physics of conflict, you
Right.
know? Without a historical grievance, yes, there is no initial spark. You need a perceived or actual wrong to ignite the fire.
Whether that's stolen land, erased culture, economic exploitation.
Exactly. But a spark burns out in seconds if it doesn't have fuel. Identity mobilization provides that fuel. It binds disparate individuals into a cohesive unit that's willing to die for each other.
Right, it creates the us versus them.
Yes. But even a highly motivated group needs a shield. And that is where geographical isolation comes in. Dense jungles, unforgiving mountain ranges, deep swamps. These terrains provide a physical barrier that just negates the state's technological advantages.
Like, a tank is completely useless if there isn't a road wide enough to drive it on.
Exactly. The geography buys the insurgents time. But time to do what? That's where external support comes in. This is the oxygen.
The cross-border safe havens.
Yes. If a neighboring hostile state is providing safe havens across a border, funding, and training, the insurgency can endlessly regenerate its losses. And finally, the governance gaps provide the vacuum that the insurgents fill to gain legitimacy.
The shadow courts and schools we talked about.
Exactly. If even one of these elements is missing, say, you manage to cut off the external support. The insurgency might fight fiercely for a year, but eventually they run out of bullets, they run out of medical supplies, money, they wither.
But when all 5 elements combine, you have a self-sustaining
A
ecosystem.
very dangerous one.
So how does this theoretical equation map onto actual terrain? Let's take the Indian context as our massive, highly complex case study. Because India is geographically massive, it's incredibly diverse, and it has dealt with numerous internal security challenges since independence. How do we apply these theoretical roots to the specific characteristics of Indian insurgencies?
The subcontinent is kind of the ultimate testing ground for this framework because you see every variation of it playing out. First, you have to look at contested sovereignty.
Right.
Many of the conflicts trace their roots back to a highly convoluted colonial legacy. When colonial powers drew arbitrary lines on maps, they often bisected tribal lands or forced incompatible groups into single administrative units.
Which baked a historical grievance right into the foundation of the state.
Exactly. And that leads directly into the identity piece of the equation. Identity in the Indian context is vastly complex. You see immense mobilization across ethnic, linguistic, religious, and tribal lines.
This is particularly evident when you study the Northeast region, right?
Yes, very much so.
Huh.
These aren't just people fighting for a larger slice of the economic pie. They're often fighting because they perceive an existential threat to their unique cultural survival.
And the geography of the Northeast acts as, like, the ultimate amplifier for that resistance. We were talking about remote, densely forested, mountainous regions.
Geography that historically kept state presence very, very weak. The terrain itself acts as a defensive fortress. It limits the deployment of heavy military assets and makes intelligence gathering incredibly difficult.
And when you add in the external linkages, I mean, the long, porous international borders.
Right. You have a situation where insurgent groups historically relied on cross-border connections for training camps, for continuous funding, and most importantly, for sanctuary.
The safe havens.
Exactly. When the military pressure gets too high, they just step across an invisible line of the jungle where the pursuing army legally cannot follow.
This highlights something so profound to me. When you list out those drivers, a convoluted colonial history, deeply rooted ethnic identity, mountainous geography, lack of state administrative presence, Not a single one of those factors is inherently military in nature.
And that is the universal law we have to extract here. A security problem is almost always a political, social, or economic problem that has festered for so long it is now displaying security symptoms.
Like a fever.
Yes. If a doctor has a patient with a raging fever caused by a bacterial infection, putting the patient in an ice bath might temporarily lower the fever. It addresses the symptom.
But if you don't administer antibiotics to kill the bacteria, the fever is going to return the second they step out of the tub.
Deploying a military battalion is the ice bath. It establishes temporary order. But building a road, opening a school, and signing a political accord, that is the antibiotic.
Let's examine how that antibiotic is actually administered in the real world. Let's stay in the Northeast for a moment and look at the evolution of the conflicts there. The sources lay out a very clear trajectory, and what's really fascinating is how the state's response had to fundamentally shift over time.
If we look at the root causes in the Northeast, the primary driver was deep alienation. You had unique tribal and ethnic identities that felt completely disconnected from the political center, and they feared being culturally and politically swallowed up.
And the environment, as we discussed, was remote and physically disconnected from the mainland. So naturally, this alienation militarized into armed movements.
Exactly.
What was the state's initial instinct? I'm guessing they didn't immediately send in, like, diplomats and social workers?
No, not at all. The initial response was what almost every state does. Heavy security operations. The central government deployed the military to quell the armed uprising. And to be fair, for a period that was necessary just to prevent the total collapse of the state's authority in those regions.
Well, right, you have to stop the bleeding first.
Yes. But a purely military approach quickly hit a ceiling. The military could win firefights, sure, but they couldn't force a deeply alienated ethnic group to suddenly feel a sense of national belonging.
Because you can't shoot a feeling of alienation.
Precisely. So you end up in this bloody stalemate. The military realizes they can't kill every last insurgent hiding in the hills, and the insurgents realize they cannot militarily defeat the sheer size of the national army.
So everyone's just stuck.
Stuck? And that realization of a stalemate is a crucial inflection point. It is what forces a massive shift in state strategy, the transition from pure military operations to a heavy emphasis on negotiation.
And this leads to an outcome that might seem kind of counterintuitive to someone who views war purely through the lens of, total victory or total defeat, because the outcome in the Northeast wasn't the total annihilation of the enemy forces. It was a series of autonomy arrangements.
Yes, the state recognized that the core grievance wasn't a desire to destroy the country. It was a desire for self-determination and cultural preservation within their own specific territory.
So the lesson extracted here is monumental. Political accommodation matters far more than pure military victory.
By creating autonomous councils and recognizing local administrative rights, the state effectively diffused the core grievance. They removed the spark.
The sources outline this process as the conflict transformation model. And when I was reading this, I was genuinely struggling to visualize the mechanics of it. Like, how does a group of hardcore armed fighters who have spent 20 years living in a jungle ambushing state police actually transition into becoming part of the state they were just fighting?
It's hard to imagine.
Right?
It really is.
What does that pipeline actually look like on a human level?
Well, it's a profound psychological and organizational shift. It starts with that alienation, which gives birth to a militant organization. The organization is structured for violence. It has commanders, intelligence wings, foot soldiers.
Right.
But after that period of conflict and the resulting stalemate, the organization enters into political dialogue. This is the messy, highly delicate phase where back-channel negotiators start talking.
And trust must be practically non-existent at this stage, like on both sides.
Oh, it is. That's why ceasefires are so fragile. But if the dialogue holds, it leads to an agreement. Our sources point to historic frameworks like the Mizo Accord, the Bodo Accord, and the various iterations of the Naga peace processes.
These aren't just like handshakes for the cameras.
No, they are complex, legal, and constitutional documents. They dictate exactly how weapons will be surrendered, how former militants will be rehabilitated or integrated into paramilitary forces, and crucially, how political power will be shared.
And the final step?
The final step is mainstream integration.
So the militants don't just disappear, they evolve. Like, the militant commander literally takes off his camouflage, puts on civilian clothes, and runs for a seat in the newly formed local assembly.
Exactly. The insurgent group transforms into a regional political party. The principle we extract here is that the state's ultimate goal in a politically motivated insurgency isn't to hunt down and imprison every last fighter. The goal is to transform them into peaceful political actors.
You're shifting the arena of the conflict from the battlefield in the jungle to the ballot box in the town square.
That's exactly. You let them fight for their identity, but you force them to do it using the Constitution instead of an AK-47.
That is just a wild mental image. But, okay, the Northeast was driven heavily by identity, culture, and ethnicity. What happens when we completely shift the environment? What happens when we look at an insurgency that isn't driven by ethnic preservation, but purely by economics, class struggle, and severe resource deprivation?
A very different beast.
Let's move our focus to central India and dive into the left-wing extremism, or LWE, analysis.
This requires a completely different analytical lens. The root cause profile of left-wing extremism, specifically the Naxalite movement, is vastly different from the Northeast. The sources trace the origin back to 1967.
Great, West Bengal.
Yes, it started in a village called Naxalbari in West Bengal. It wasn't an ethnic struggle. It was a violent rebellion by deeply impoverished, landless working peasants against wealthy, exploitative local landlords.
A classic Marxist class struggle.
Uh-oh.
Over the means of production and land ownership.
That exactly.
So it started as a peasant revolt in the late 60s, but it evolved into something much larger and far more entrenched. The sources note that a major driver of this evolution was massive displacement due to state and private mining operations. And there is a specific piece of legislation mentioned, the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, which the sources highlight as a massive catalyst.
Yes.
Can you explain the actual mechanism of how a conservation law fuels a violent insurgency? Because that sounds contradictory.
It does, but it's a perfect example of how administrative actions create security crises. The Forest Conservation Act was designed, on paper, to protect India's incredible biodiversity and prevent deforestation.
That sounds great.
It sounds great. But the mechanism of enforcement was catastrophic for the indigenous tribal populations, the Adivasis, who had lived in and depended on those forests for centuries. Their entire livelihood gathering minor forest produce, small-scale farming, grazing animals was suddenly classified as illegal trespassing on protected state land.
So overnight, their way of life is criminalized, just by a stroke of a pen in the capital.
Yes. You have populations that possess no formal paper deeds to the land their ancestors have lived on for generations. Suddenly, forest guards arrive to enforce the new law. The tribes are evicted or heavily harassed to make way for either conservation zones or, paradoxically, state-sanctioned mining operations.
Because these forests sit on top of incredibly rich mineral deposits.
Exactly. So you have severe resource deprivation, a total lack of modern education, and widespread unemployment.
That creates a population that is desperate, angry, and feeling completely abandoned by the state, which I imagine makes them incredibly easy targets for Maoist ideology.
Completely. The insurgents arrive in these tribal villages not with a message of ethnic separatism, but with a message of brutal, swift economic justice. They look at the displaced tribal populations and say, the state stole your land to give it to billionaires. We will give you a rifle to take it back. They offer money. They offer a sense of agency, and most importantly, they offer immediate retribution against the landlords or the corrupt local officials.
I want to focus on the environment here because central India is a fascinating paradox. As you mentioned, the land is incredibly resource-rich. We're talking massive deposits of coal, iron ore, bauxite. But the people living on top of those minerals are developmentally among the poorest in the country.
And that paradox is maintained by what our sources term the governance vacuum. Because these areas were so remote, so heavily forested, and frankly viewed mostly as resource extraction zones rather than population centers, the state's administrative footprint was virtually non-existent.
Like no paved roads, no functioning state clinics.
No schools, no effective policing. The state was simply absent.
And as we know from both physics and politics, a vacuum abhors emptiness. It always pulls something in to fill it.
If the state isn't there to govern, someone else will. The insurgents stepped into that vacuum and established an alternative authority. They became the de facto shadow state in those regions.
Like the shadow courts we mentioned earlier.
Yes. If a villager had a land dispute, they didn't go to the state courts, which were 50 miles away and steeped in unnavigable bureaucracy. They went to the Maoist Yan Adalat, the People's Court, which would issue a verdict on the spot. If someone committed a crime, the insurgents provided the policing.
So the lesson here is incredibly stark. Administrative absence directly equals insurgent influence.
Precisely.
So if you are the security forces tasked with going into this region, it sounds like an absolute nightmare. You are going into an area where the terrain is hostile, there are no roads for your vehicles, and the local population entirely relies on the people you are trying to hunt down.
It is one of the most difficult tactical environments on Earth. The intelligence network is completely inverted. The state forces are blind because the population will not talk to them.
Out of fear.
Out of a mix of genuine loyalty to the insurgents and profound fear of retribution. Meanwhile, the insurgents know exactly when a military convoy leaves its base, how many men are in it, and what weapons they carry, because the local villagers act as their early warning system.
I found something in the sources regarding this that genuinely stopped me in my tracks. It's this concept they called the inverted matrix of success. Because for a long time, the state was measuring its success in these LWE areas entirely wrong.
This is such a devastating critique of conventional military thinking. Historically, how does a military measure success?
By attrition, right? Body counts.
Yes. In the LWE theaters, success was being tracked by a kill count metric. How many violent attacks were repelled? How many insurgents were eliminated in encounters? How many weapons were seized?
But wait, if you're fighting an armed rebellion, why wouldn't you measure success by how many weapons you've taken off the battlefield? That seems logical.
Because taking a weapon off the battlefield doesn't fill the governance vacuum that caused the weapon to be picked up in the first place. This raises an incredibly important question about the utility of force. Let's say a heavily armed security battalion pushes into a dense forest. They fight a grueling battle, they take casualties, but they eventually clear the area of insurgents. They plant a flag.
Mission accomplished.
From a pure military perspective, that is a victory. The kill count metric looks great. But if the state fails to immediately follow up that military clearing with civil administration, if they don't immediately start paving a road, building a clinic, and installing a civilian magistrate, what happens?
The moment the battalion rotates out and goes back to base, the insurgents just walk right back out of the deeper jungle.
Exactly. It is a complete failure of counterinsurgency. If the vacuum remains, the alternative authority returns. The state was fighting the same battles over the same patches of jungle year after year, measuring success in body bags while the actual root causes remained completely untouched.
So how does a massive state apparatus actually pivot from that? How do you reverse that inverted matrix and start fighting the real war? The sources introduce the Ministry of Home Affairs' modern strategy to combat left-wing extremism, and it's known by the acronym SEMATAN.
Right.
Now, we aren't going to just read off a list of letters, but I want to dive into the operational logic behind this strategy, because looking at it, it feels less like traditional military doctrine and more like, I don't know, a corporate turnaround strategy mixed with statecraft.
That's a very accurate reading of it. The SEMATAN strategy is an acknowledgement that brute force alone has failed. Let's look at the operational pillars it introduced. First, it emphasizes smart leadership and an aggressive strategy.
But aggressive here doesn't mean indiscriminately kicking down doors, right?
No, it means shifting from a reactive, static posture where police forces sit in fortified, isolated camps just waiting to be ambushed to a proactive stance. It's about dominating the area so the insurgents can't move freely, but doing so with highly trained, highly motivated forces.
And the motivation aspect has to be massive. You are asking young men and women to deploy to the most grueling environments imaginable. I mean, the heat is suffocating, malaria is rampant, and the psychological stress of knowing an IED could be buried under any dirt path takes a massive toll.
Which is why this strategy demands specialized training. You can't take a soldier trained for conventional tank warfare on the plains and drop them into the canopy of central India. It just doesn't work. But the real game changer in this strategy is the shift toward actionable intelligence.
How does that actually work in practice? We established that the population doesn't want to talk to the state. How do you get intelligence without alienating the village?
You have to move away from the massive blind area sweeps. In the past, if forces suspected insurgents were in a 5-mile radius, they would sweep through multiple villages, detaining dozens of young men for questioning.
Which just causes immense trauma.
And essentially acts as a recruiting drive for the insurgents. Actionable intelligence means relying on highly localized informant networks, intercepting communications, and using targeted surgical strikes. You only go in when you know exactly who is in that specific hut. It minimizes civilian harassment.
But the part of SEMATAN that really caught my eye is the introduction of dashboard-based KPIs and KRAs, key performance indicators and key result areas. Why on earth is the Ministry of Home Affairs using corporate middle management jargon to fight a jungle war?
Because it forces a complete paradigm shift in how success is measured. It is the direct cure to the inverted matrix. By instituting dashboards, the government is forcing district magistrates, police chiefs, and military commanders to look at the same screen.
Okay, so everyone is on the same page.
Exactly. And on that screen, the metrics of success are no longer just insurgents neutralized. The metrics are how many kilometers of all-weather road were paved this quarter, how many new mobile phone towers were erected, how many local tribal youth were enrolled in technical training institutes, how many zero-balance bank accounts were opened.
You are literally bringing accountability to the governance vacuum. You are holding the state responsible for its own absence.
Precisely. And to achieve those KPIs, the strategy heavily relies on harnessing technology. Because the jungle strips away the state's advantage. It hides movement from satellites, it makes traditional radio communications difficult, so the state starts using high-altitude drones with thermal imaging to pierce the canopy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they use advanced geospatial mapping to plan secure road alignments. They use technology to regain the upper hand.
But even within central India, the conditions aren't uniform. The terrain in Chhattisgarh is different from the terrain in Jharkhand.
Which is why the strategy mandates an action plan for each specific theater. It recognizes that decentralization is key. You cannot copy-paste a tactic from one district to another just because they are both classified as left-wing extremism areas. The local tribal dynamics, the local economy, and the local geography require bespoke approaches.
And finally, there is a massive focus on choking off the economic lifeblood of the movement, denying access to financing. How do you defund a jungle insurgency? It's not like they are trading stocks on Wall Street.
No, but insurgencies are incredibly expensive to run. You have to feed, clothe, and arm thousands of cadres. You have to buy ammunition on the black market. Where does that money come from?
Extortion.
Exactly. In the LWE regions, it historically came from massive extortion networks. They would levy taxes on the massive mining corporations operating in the area. They would extort infrastructure contractors. If a company wanted to build a road, they had to pay a cut to the insurgents so their bulldozers wouldn't be burned overnight.
So cutting off financing means securing the infrastructure projects, protecting the contractors, and auditing the local illicit economies, like illegal sand mining or unregulated logging, which the insurgents use to launder money.
Exactly. You starve the movement of the capital it needs to sustain its shadow state.
But security operations, even brilliantly planned ones that use drones and choke off illicit funding, are still fundamentally about stabilization, right? They're only half the coin. The other half is what actually kills the insurgency permanently. And that brings us to the concept of development as a counterinsurgency tool.
This is where statecraft truly shines. And it's perhaps the most vital lesson of the entire analysis. The sources detail how development and infrastructure are literally deployed as weapons of internal security. It is not just benevolence. It is a calculated strategic offensive against the insurgents' ideology.
I want to break down what a developmental weapon actually looks like on the ground. Because to someone living in a modern city, a paved road is just a convenience. But in this context, it's a lethal blow to an insurgency.
A road is the most dangerous thing the state can build in an insurgent stronghold. A road means police reinforcements can arrive in 20 minutes instead of 3 days.
Wow, yeah.
A road means a farmer can transport their produce to a major market town and get a fair price, rather than being forced to sell it at a massive discount to an insurgent-controlled middleman. It connects the isolated ecosystem directly into the national bloodstream.
The sources place a huge emphasis on telecom connectivity and financial inclusion, too, like erecting mobile phone towers and opening zero-balance bank accounts.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Sure.
If a marginalized villager has an armed insurgent standing in their living room demanding food and loyalty, how does having a bank account or a smartphone protect them?
Well, it doesn't protect them from the immediate threat of violence in that specific moment. But it actively and aggressively competes with the insurgents' overall influence and narrative. Remember, the insurgents' core pitch is, the state has abandoned you. The state only wants to exploit you.
But suddenly, a mobile tower goes up. The villager has a smartphone. They can see what life is like in the rest of the country. They can call an ambulance. And crucially, through financial inclusion like direct cash transfers, the state is suddenly delivering tangible benefits.
Bypassing the corrupt local middlemen entirely.
Yes. When the central government deposits agricultural subsidies directly into a farmer's newly opened bank account, provides a subsidized gas cylinder for cooking so they don't have to illegally forage for firewood, and builds a paved road to a school, The state is proving its utility.
It's offering a real alternative.
Think about the choice facing that marginalized individual. The insurgent arrives offering a stolen rifle, a life of endless hardship in the jungle, and a shared grievance. The state arrives offering a bank account, connectivity, and a tangible path to a better standard of living.
Over time, the state simply outcompetes the insurgency in the marketplace of governance.
The narrative of abandonment just collapses.
I want to vividly illustrate how effective this has been, because the sources provide data that creates an incredible mental map of the Red Corridor.
Right, the peak expansion map.
Yeah, if you picture a map of India in the early 2000s, at the peak expansion of left-wing extremism, there is this massive, terrifying red swath running straight down the spine of central and eastern India. We are talking about an insurgent shadow state controlling over 10 million hectares of dense forested land. It looked like an unstoppable internal hemorrhage.
It was arguably the greatest internal security threat the state had ever faced. But then, look at the timeline of the state response. They deployed that simultaneous push we just outlined. Highly targeted security operations to push the militants back, immediately followed by the aggressive deployment of roads, mobile towers, and bank accounts to fill the vacuum permanently.
And the visual shrinking of that red map is dramatic. The sources state that in 2013, 182 districts were classified as affected by LWE violence. Fast forward to 2025, and that number has plummeted to just 18 districts.
It's a massive reduction.
They have compressed a massive shadow state into a few isolated pockets. The projection in our sources is the expected total eradication of the movement as a major threat by 2026.
And what's vital to understand is why this happened. It wasn't just because the government deployed more battalions of troops. You could have sent 1 million troops into those forests and achieved nothing but a higher body count.
The map shrank because the smartphone, the direct benefit transfer, and the excavator penetrated the jumble.
Exactly. The physical terrain remained as tough as ever, but the psychological and economic terrain was completely transformed. The people chose the state over the insurgency.
So we've looked at identity-driven conflicts in the Northeast and economic, resource-driven conflicts in the jungles of central India. But what happens when we completely change the map again?
A new theater.
Let's move from the heartland to the northern borders. Let's look at the Jammu and Kashmir case study. The rules of the game must change entirely in that environment, right?
Drastically. The sources make it unequivocally clear that Jammu and Kashmir is a radically different conflict type. It is classified not as a true organic domestic insurgency in the traditional sense, but fundamentally as a proxy war.
And that changes the entire root cause framework we discussed earlier.
Completely. While there are certainly local political grievances, the defining, overriding driver of the conflict is external state sponsorship. The sources explicitly note Pakistan's direct, systematic involvement in recruiting, training, funding, and providing safe havens for terrorist organizations operating in J&K.
Let's run this through our analytical framework to see exactly how different it is from the LWE scenario. If we look at the cause, it's a volatile mix of contested sovereignty and that heavy external sponsorship. It's not a peasant rebellion over forest rights.
Exactly. The environment is a highly complex, deeply entrenched political landscape. In central India, the insurgents capitalized on a governance vacuum. The state simply wasn't there.
But in J&K, the state was very much present.
Yes, but the political debate was entirely different. It wasn't about demanding a local school. It was a domestic issue that, due to the UN and historical wars, acquired massive international dimensions. The narrative was centered on Azadi, freedom, separatism, and constitutional status.
And the information dimension was entirely different too, right?
It was a highly propagandized environment driven by cross-border ideological narratives.
So building a road or opening a bank account isn't going to have the same magic bullet effect here because the core driver isn't a lack of basic infrastructure. The core driver is an externally funded ideological and territorial dispute. What does the state response look like in a proxy war environment?
The response has to be multi-tiered. Militarily, it involves heavy, sustained security deployments aimed not just at neutralizing local militants, but critically, at sealing the border to stop the infiltration of foreign fighters and weaponry.
Right, addressing the external support.
It involves targeting the launch pads and the host country bases. But internally, the response involved transforming the very foundation of governance approaches. The sources note periods of direct central rule, and fundamentally, the watershed moment in 2019, the abrogation of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution.
Let's explain the mechanism of that, because it's mentioned as a massive catalyst for change in the sources. Article 370 was a constitutional provision that gave the state of Jammu and Kashmir a special autonomous status, like its own constitution, a separate flag, and independence over all matters except foreign affairs, defense, and communications.
Correct. And from a security analysis standpoint, the abrogation of that article was designed to completely dismantle the political and administrative ambiguity that the proxy war thrived on.
How so?
By revoking that special status and fully integrating J&K into the national constitutional framework, the state fundamentally altered the playing field. It removed the legal and psychological barrier between the region and the rest of the country.
Which leads to the outcome. The sources describe a dramatic reconfiguration of center-state relations. It catalyzed a fundamental change in the prevailing political, economic, and security environment. By fully integrating the region, it allowed for federal laws, anti-corruption bureaus, and outside economic investment to flow into the state in a way that was previously blocked by the autonomous structure.
And the lesson here is incredibly stark. It ties right back to our central question. The classification of the conflict dictates the entire strategy. You absolutely cannot fight a state-sponsored proxy war with international dimensions the exact same way you fight an economic rebellion driven by displaced tribal populations in a central forest.
Because the root causes are different, the fuel is different, and therefore the statecraft must be different.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis. We have looked at three wildly different conflict environments. How does a nation tie all these disparate, complex lessons together into a coherent national doctrine? The sources outline what they call a comprehensive response model.
This model is the blueprint for modern statecraft in dealing with internal security. It synthesizes all the tools we've discussed into a single, unified approach. It's an equation: security operations plus intelligence plus development plus narrative plus diplomacy.
Diplomacy is the new variable there. In the LWE context, you don't really need diplomats. But in a proxy war, diplomacy is a weapon system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In the context of J&K or any externally sponsored conflict, you use diplomacy to build an international consensus against state-sponsored terrorism. You use financial task forces and international sanctions to choke off the international financial flows that fund the terror networks. You use diplomatic pressure to isolate the sponsoring state.
But at the very center of all of this, whether you are deploying diplomats at the UN, building roads in central India, or negotiating peace accords in the Northeast, there's one core overriding philosophy. I want to contrast two ideas: the control of territory versus the trust of people.
This is the philosophical bedrock of successful counterinsurgency. If we connect this back to everything we've discussed, this is why population-centric operations are absolutely vital. The sources highlight massive military initiatives like the Indian Army's Operation Sadbhavana, which focuses on building schools, organizing medical camps, and creating infrastructure in conflict zones.
The central, unavoidable realization is that the population is the ultimate prize.
Yes.
Let me challenge that perspective for a moment. From a purely cynical, hard power military standpoint, if I roll an armored brigade into a valley, I control that valley. I control the checkpoints, the roads, the airspace. Why do I care if the villagers whose homes I'm driving past trust me? I have the guns.
Because controlling territory through sheer force is exhausted, expensive, and ultimately fragile. You are just an occupying force waiting to be bled dry by 1,000 tiny cuts. What does the population actually provide? They provide three indispensable things that a tank cannot: legitimacy, information, and stability.
The early warning system we talked about.
Precisely. The people are the ultimate sensor network. If they trust the state, or even if they just believe the state offers a better future than the insurgents, they will provide the information. They will tell the police when a stranger comes into the village. They will point out where the IED is buried.
And without that information, your armored brigade is completely blind.
The insurgency starves when the population stops feeding it, hiding it, and funding it.
This philosophical difference perfectly sets up our final grand comparison. This is the crucible where we test our central question. Can a model from one environment be copied to another? We are going to look at the Sri Lankan approach versus the Indian approach.
Let's start with Sri Lanka, specifically their successful final phase of the civil war against the LTTE, known as Elam IV. This is often studied as a textbook case of a pure military solution to an insurgency.
What were their strengths in that specific operation? From a military standpoint, what made Elam V successful?
Well, they had a crystal clear, uncompromising objective: the total annihilation of the LTTE. They maintained a pure military focus. They ignored international pressure for ceasefires, giving their military total operational freedom. And they utilized a massive concentration of military capability, deploying overwhelming firepower, naval blockades, and airstrikes. They went all in on the use of force.
And here's the devil's advocate question. It worked, right? The war ended in 2009, the LTTE was destroyed, the violence stopped. So why shouldn't another country facing a severe insurgency just copy that model? Why not just use overwhelming, unbridled force and end it once and for all?
Because it ended the violence, but it did not end the conflict.
Ah.
The sources point out severe, lasting limitations to this approach. It was fundamentally a model of exclusion. The text explicitly states that they applied unbridled force with the total abjuration of basic human rights. The civilian casualties were immense. Entire populations were caught in free fire zones.
So you crushed the militant wing, but you traumatized the entire ethnic population in the process.
Exactly. The immense human cost meant that the deep underlying root causes the feelings of marginalization and ethnic discrimination among the Tamil population were never addressed. In fact, the brutality of the final phase likely deepened those grievances.
So it left a simmering discontent.
Yes, because it was purely a military victory, not a political resolution. You eradicated the weed by salting the earth, but the soil remains toxic.
Now let's contrast that with the Indian approach described in our sources, which had to operate in a completely different democratic and demographic reality.
The sources characterize India's model as fundamentally inclusive. It relies on political accommodation, the devolution of administrative powers, massive socio-economic development, and employing only limited force.
Limited force is a fascinating concept when you are fighting an armed rebellion. It almost sounds like fighting with one hand tied behind your back.
It requires immense discipline. In the Indian context, force is not used to annihilate an identity group. Force is primarily used to prevent atrocities against civilians, to maintain a semblance of normal administrative life, and essentially to pressure warring militant groups to the negotiation table.
It is calibrated violence used strictly to create the conditions for dialogue.
Exactly. The ultimate goal isn't a battlefield victory, it's a political accord.
Let's build an applicability matrix right now to summarize this. We are going to evaluate specific lessons and tactical doctrines from the Sri Lankan Elam the Faith model and ask, can India, or any democracy facing similar internal constraints, copy this? We will judge it as applicable, modification needed, or not applicable.
This is a great way to distill the tactical realities. Let's run down the list. Lesson 1, the use of small, highly mobile teams and intelligence networks.
Applicable, yes. The reason. It is a tactical necessity in any counterinsurgency environment. You need agile, intelligence-driven units that can navigate difficult terrain, whether it's a Sri Lankan lagoon or a central Indian jungle.
Lesson 2, the use of force.
Modification needed. The reason. Unbridled, overwhelming force that utilizes heavy artillery or airstrikes against domestic civilian areas causes unacceptable human suffering. In a population-centric model, force must be strictly limited and calibrated to force a political dialogue, not to achieve total physical destruction.
Lesson 3, the approach to human rights.
Modification needed. The reason. India and any state seeking long-term integration must prioritize preventing civilian suffering. A population-centric approach requires a strict focus on human rights. You simply cannot win the trust of the population, which we established is the ultimate prize if state forces are acting with impunity and violating their rights.
Lesson 4, the end goal of political resolution.
Applicable, yes, but with a massive caveat. A democratic state prefers a political resolution over a pure military victory anyway. The reason is that political resolution ensures long-term mainstream integration. It builds a lasting peace based on constitutional compromise, not just a temporary silence born out of fear and military suppression.
This brings us into the final phase of our deep dive. We want to synthesize all of this complex theory into a definitive toolkit you can take away. Let's extract the universal, non-negotiable rules of counterinsurgency based on all the case studies we've dissected today.
I see 6 absolute pillars here. First, you must deeply understand the root causes. Are you fighting an ethnic identity struggle, an economic resource rebellion, or an externally funded proxy war?
Second, you have to build actionable intelligence. Blind military sweeps only create more enemies.
Third, you must find a way to control or disrupt external support to cut off the insurgency's oxygen.
Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, you must protect the population. They are the objective, not the physical terrain.
Fifth, you have to aggressively create governance. You must fill the vacuum with roads, schools, and justice before the alternative shadow authority does.
And sixth, you must always keep a political pathway open. The ultimate success is transforming the militant commander into a civilian politician.
To make this practically useful, let's provide you with structural frameworks you can use to analyze any future internal security challenge you might read about in the news. Whenever you look at a conflict, run it through this model: introduction, context, comparison, analysis, lessons, and conclusion. Let's look at how you'd structure your thinking around the major themes we covered.
If you are analyzing the Sri Lankan model of unbridled force versus long-term peace, you would introduce the conflict, compare the swift military victory to the unresolved political grievances of the minority population, and analyze how military suppression without political accommodation is often a temporary fix.
If you were comparing counterinsurgency approaches, you would contrast a development-focused, infrastructure-heavy response for economic insurgencies like LWE against an identity-focused, negotiation-heavy response for regions like the Northeast, and a security and diplomacy-focused response for proxy wars like J&K.
If you are discussing the absolute necessity of parallel governance, your analysis centers on the inverted matrix. You explain how clearing an area with military force is entirely useless if the state doesn't immediately follow it up with civil administration and essential services.
When exploring why territory control fails without population trust, you focus on the mechanics of legitimacy. You prove that the people dictate the outcome because they control the flow of intelligence and the stability of the region.
And finally, when examining lessons for future internal security challenges, you have to look at how technology is shifting the battlefield. The new front line isn't just a jungle patrol. It is financial disruption algorithms tracking illicit funding. And it is the deployment of mobile data networks to break the psychological isolation of marginalized populations.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's look at the incredible journey we've taken today. We took abstract, complex data and converted it into visual maps in your mind. You can clearly see the shrinking red corridor of a left-wing extremism map, watching a massive shadow state collapse from 182 districts down to 18, not just because of bullets, but because of paved roads, telecom towers, and zero-balance bank accounts.
We track the delicate evolution of peace accords, understanding the human pipeline that takes a deeply alienated tribal fighter and transitions them into mainstream political integration. We map the cause and effect chains, how a bureaucratic policy decision like a Forest Conservation Act can accidentally criminalize a livelihood, create a governance vacuum, and birth a multi-decade guerrilla war.
We have covered a massive amount of historical and strategic ground, from the deep roots of contested colonial sovereignty to the modern corporate-style application of dashboard-based key performance indicators in the middle of a jungle conflict. It is incredibly dense, analytical material, but understanding these mechanics fundamentally changes how you view global security. Thank you for taking this extended journey with us and for stepping into the shoes of a security analyst today.
Before we sign off, our analysis of the changing technological landscape raises one final, provocative question for you to mull over. We saw how the introduction of mobile data and smartphones dramatically reduced the support base of insurgents in the deepest jungles by connecting marginalized people to the national mainstream.
Right.
But as our entire world becomes increasingly digitized, consider this. Does the smartphone truly eradicate the insurgency? Or does it merely force the governance vacuum and the alternate authority to evolve from the physical jungle into the digital sphere? Are the insurgencies of tomorrow going to be fought over network access, digital identity, and algorithmic manipulation rather than forest access and physical terrain?
That is exactly what we mean when we say you can't just spray desert weed killer on a jungle vine. The environment dictates the threat, and the environment is constantly rapidly evolving. Keep questioning the narratives around you. Always look for the underlying root causes rather than just the security symptoms, and we will see you on the next deep dive.